In today's video, I'm going to give you tips on how to increase your damage inside of Genshin Impact. There are a good amount of things I see people actually doing wrong and not understanding when it comes to increasing your damage, but most of these things may seem obvious to some, because if you are in the end game, you're probably doing all these already, but to the newer players or the mid players or the people who just don't understand how the game works, these will definitely be some helpful tips on how to increase your damage by like 10 times and more. So I'm not going to waste any more time, let's get on to the first tip. Now the first tip is actually going to be increase the level of your talents and weapon. I've seen people with like level 80 to level 90 characters and their talents are still like level 5 and 4. It doesn't matter how high level your character is, if your talents aren't leveled up, that character isn't going to do any damage. And that also goes for the weapon too, because that base attack on that weapon increases the attack of literally everything you have and even attack resistant substats you have on your artifacts. So without those two leveled up, it really decreases your damage by so much. And this goes for main DPS and even support units as well. As you can see, I have my Ningguang's talents all maxed out and triple crown because she is my favorite character. But if I didn't have these talents leveled up, even with good artifacts, my Ningguang will still do not much damage because the talents and everything have scaling, and the less scaling that has, the less of an impact these artifacts and weapon will have on me. So you want to pay attention to the talents on your main DPS as well as your support users. As you can see, I have my Beto's talents at level 8 and I do have some constellations, so luckily it does increase it to 11. And even on my Lisa, I have 8-8, on my Zhongli, 10-8, you get the idea. And then of course the weapons. Don't neglect the weapons on your characters either, because your character's weapons really help the damage too, because it can have amazing substats like the Solar Pearl that helps me get crit rate, or other weapons that help you get energy recharge. Artifacts are also really important, but the first thing I want to show off, because people really only focus on artifacts most of the time because that's all really people want to talk about, but they never try to give you any tips on leveling up your weapons and leveling up your talents are as important or even more important than leveling up and getting good artifacts. So here and there, make sure to grab some talent level up materials and make sure you level up your talents and also your weapons. You can't level up these if all you do is get on Genshin and grind artifacts all day every day with your resin, and then you have no resin left to do other stuff. Next, make sure you go for stats rather than artifact sets. Yeah, artifact stats do make a huge impact on your character and help boost the damage by a lot, but some people tunnel vision for that artifact set and ignore all the substats on the artifacts, and then suddenly all the stats are really bad, but they only want to focus on the artifact set. And a great example for this actually is my Keqing. My Keqing has 2-piece gladiators, but she actually doesn't have 2-piece Thundering Fury on her either. And that's because I've been prioritizing stats over the sets for my Keqing. So I have this amazing gladiator flower with a whole bunch of crit damage and crit rate and attack percentage, but I don't have 2-piece Thundering Fury, so I could switch it out for this Thundering Fury flower, but as you can see, the crit damage is way lower, it has energy recharge now, I have less attack percentage, and it even has flat defense on it. If I wanted to tunnel vision for that artifact set, I would put this on, but that is not how you want to build your characters. Of course you want to try to get the artifact sets, but if you don't have the full set, you can always go 2-piece of something or 2-piece of something else, or just 2-piece of one artifact set and wait to get your other artifacts up and get good stats on them. I could use this gladiator feather, or I could put on this terrible Thundering Fury feather. So do not worry about the artifact sets, because eventually if you do keep on farming the sets for those characters, you will get a good piece eventually. So as you're still leveling up the character, make sure you prioritize the stats rather than the sets to increase your damage majorly for a good time before you can actually refine it and make it an amazing build. The next tip is to make sure your crit ratio is a nice ratio and stat prioritization for certain characters. Now if you're a newer person at Genshin, you might not understand what I mean by crit ratio. Basically, you can have 1-to-2 ratios or 1-to-3 ratios. 1-to-2 crit ratios are basically for every point of crit rate, you have 2 points of crit damage. For example, if you have 60% crit rate, the good amount of crit damage you can want is 120%. Of course, that could be increased, that could be lessened, you could have more crit rate, more than crit damage. It is completely fine, but those are some of the best ratios for having good damage. And for some characters, you want to have a 1-to-3 ratio. For every 1 point of crit rate, you have 3 points of crit damage. For example, 50% crit rate turns into 150% crit damage. Now this could be good on some characters because some characters increase the crit rate after using abilities or increase the crit rate of their team, so that is why you want to know your characters and make sure you prioritize the stats that they actually need. For example, if we look at my Ningguang, I have 62% crit rate and 178% crit damage. Now that is actually pretty close to a 1-to-3 ratio. Of course I do have a little bit more crit rate and a little less crit damage, but that's actually completely fine. As long as you get a good ratio to where you're critting often and then hitting big numbers when you do crit, it is completely fine. And then the next part of this tip, stat prioritization for certain characters. Now not all characters will need crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, energy recharge like normal DPS users do. Some might need elemental mastery, defense, HP. Different characters need different stats prioritized. For example, Zhongli's build is basically all around HP. His shield gets massive damage absorption based off his HP, and even his passive will give more damage to his burst, skill, normal and charge attacks based off his HP too. So for most people, they'll want to build a whole lot of HP on their Zhongli and try not to focus on damage all too much. And then there's people like Zarya who will give her own crit rate to her teammates. Which means you might not want to focus as much on crit damage and just try to get as much crit rate as you can. Also looking into animal characters, Elemental Mastery is the best stat you can ever build on every animal character besides Zhao. Now Zhao's a special case where his swirls doesn't really matter all too much and you just want raw damage and more attack, which is why it's very important to look deeply into your character skills to see what you want to build on them. Because swirl reactions are a big part of animal characters' damage, so if you have no elemental mastery on them, they'll do a lot less damage. And then lastly, I want to prioritize some GL characters that actually scale off of defense. Because defense is usually one of the least used options in Genshin, so you might have been throwing away a whole bunch of defense options for characters that you actually have that could use them really nicely. For example, Ito scales very nicely off of defense based off his burst, and even his passive, which allows his charge attacks to do increased damage based off his defense. And this also goes for Goro, Yunjin. I think you pretty much get the idea. So always look into the characters you are building and make sure you pay attention to the stats because you are probably building them wrong and you're probably building them in the least efficient way. Now the next thing is actually enemy resistance. Now there's actually some enemies in Genshin Impact that have certain resistances to certain elements or even physical damage. For example, if you look at all these slimes, each one of these types are invisible to a certain element. For example, this one can't be hurt by Pyro, this can't be hurt by Hydro, this can't be hurt by Electro, you get the idea. And that can actually go for a lot of these enemies because a lot of these enemies are actually invulnerable to certain damage types. But there are also some enemies that aren't invulnerable to them, but just take a lot less damage from them. For example, these Fatui agents, this Pyro one actually takes less damage from Pyro, and this goes for the Electro and Cryo one too. Both of the elements that they're based off of, they aren't invulnerable to them, but they will take massively less damage from them. And the Ruin Guards, Ruin Hunters, and other stuff in this section actually has increased damage resistance to physical damage. So if you run physical damage characters against these people, you're all going to see a good dip in damage. And this also goes for the Whopper Flowers, the Redis Vines, and even Primordial Geo Bishop can change his element to a certain element and make him more resistant to that specific element. Basically, I'm trying to say is be aware of the enemies that you are facing and putting your team up against, especially in the Spiral Abyss, because you'll definitely want to be paying attention to that, so you make sure that you bring the right team to avoid any resistances that the enemies may have. Now there's probably a whole entire chart online that you can look at to see all the resistances of every single enemy inside of Genshin, so if you do want to go and look at all that, then I definitely recommend you do. And the last tip we're going to be talking about in this video is team synergy. Of course, I fully advocate for playing the characters that you love to play and actually enjoy playing instead of going for characters that give out the most DPS. But if you do want to push as much DPS as you can, you will have to make sure to level up some other characters for better team synergies. So if you take a look at the team on screen, yeah, I do like Ningguang, I do like Beidou, I do like myself some Sucrose, and maybe you also like yourself some Barber. Now the problem is that this team has no synergy at all. Although I do have a main DPS which is Ningguang and an off-field DPS Beidou, the other two characters don't really fit in the composition all that greatly. Sucrose is pretty nice, but she actually can't swirl Geo, so most of the time when you pair animal characters and Geo characters together, it's not going to do as well, unless it's for a very specific team, like the Zhao Geo team. And yeah, Bulba does heal, but she doesn't really add anything else to this party. This is going to get no freezing involved or vaporize reactions getting put to use in this build. So for teams, there's usually always a good way you want to do it. You always want to have a big main DPS in your party. That could be your Ningguang, Raiden, Eula, and whoever else you want a main DPS. And then next, you either want a shielder or a healer. And sometimes you can even have both. For example, if I want to go ahead and put Zhongli in here, now I have an Elemental Resonance, which if you don't know which those are, if you press the Elemental Resonance button, if you have two of the same element in your party, you actually get a little bit of a buff. I'm not going to go through all these in the video, but if you want to check in game and go over all the Elemental Resonances, you are free and welcome to do so. So now I have the Geo Elemental Resonance, which increases my Geo damage by a lot. And also for some teams, they're a really good idea to have an off-field DPS doing damage while your other main DPS character is doing as much damage as they can. Really great ones are people like Xingqiu, Zarya, Beidou, and Zhangling. And now I have a main DPS, a shielder, and an off-field DPS. So I have a lot of the criteria, so the last slot can actually be pretty flexible, so it can change depending on your team, the people you want to play, the synergies you already have. So another great thing to have in a team is a buffer to buff your whole entire party with the skills or artifact sets they have on. People like that could be Mona with Zarya, and even Diana if you have Noblesse Oblige. And also having elemental characters is really nice for Viridescent Veil and Aware artifact sets, because that would decrease the resistance to specific elements, but since I'm in a Geo team, I'm not going to do that. So I'm actually going to put on Bennett because he also heals, and he gives giant buffs to his burst and his artifact set I currently have on him. So that is what I mean by team synergies. Make sure something is going to be happening throughout your team, whether that's elemental reactions, healing, shielding, off-field DPS, something that your team will focus on and boost that type of damage by a lot. And there we go, that's basically all for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope this video does help some people increase the damage in Genshin, because I've seen a lot of mistakes with their talents, the team synergies. They're just backing some wacky teams that don't make sense. They invest too much into the artifacts that they don't care about the stats on them, or care about the talents or weapons, or just don't pay attention to the types of enemies that they are facing. So yeah, that's basically all for me. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one.